So quite obviously, what one can get away with in terms of the kinds of language that one uses and deploys, and the relationship of that language to spheres of social political marginalization and insult, uh, depends on one's own positionality and and the way that that positionality is constructed by the social arenas in which one participates and the society at large. So, in other words, what one gets called on is largely a function of one's status in relationship to, particularly to positions of marginalization and to positions of what would one call it? Socially acceptable bigotries and biases within the culture in which one resides, and if bigotry and bias fails to encompass all of the isms, racism, ableism, etc. I don't intend it to be exclusive that way, but rather inclusive in the sense that biases and bigotry would encompass all of the articulations of the way that psychologies of normalcy and acceptability, right, exclude and reject, right, certain kinds of voices and silence certain kinds of voices while raising the volume of other types of voices, no matter how malignant or insensitive or violent those voices might be. So I think that it was Hedgehog who hinted at the discourse surrounding Lizzo's changing of the lyrics to her song "Girls," which is interesting to us for a number of reasons, because "Girls" expresses this kind of growl in it, and the girls, of course, that she is referring to are in fact not girls at all, but women, and so that term, right, is already a reappropriation of the way that patriarchy infantilizes women to begin with, and then the growl in it sort of underscores that, and then the capitalization further underscores that, right? And so there's a lot stated there even before we get to the removal of the I within that word, and the replacement of the I, the first person pronoun, if one translates that particular letter into that particular linguistic function, which one certainly doesn't have to do in reading this word, but one could do in reading this word, and in transforming that, right, first person I, if one reads it that way, into the automatopoeic roar of whatever this might be, referencing the or growl, the growl or roar of whatever animal growls and roars. So so without positing from my perspective what that might be, I'll just leave it at that. But so the original lyrics, and what Hedgehog was merely hinting at, was the whole theatrical, the whole theatricalization, right, of of the censorship in a realm in which the context itself is about deployments of language and they're misogynist and ableist and and beauty normative standards of engaging body image as a site of potential verbal violence and a point of potential marginalizing as an inscription, right, upon the meaning of one's body. And for all of us whose bodies in one way or another have been inscribed with a performative that marginalizes us as a positionality, whatever that might be, or a mind, that belongs to our bodies that marginalizes us as a positionality in one way or another. I'll get to that in terms of my personal experience of being marginalized and why Lizzo's theatricalization of language's functional use in terms of such marginalizing performativities doesn't offend me at all. And in fact, I find amusing, in spite of the fact that, for decades I have worked, both as a I want to say, representational worker, that is, one might say artist or writer or performer or whatnot, someone who makes representations but is concerned with dimensions of socio-political identity and access to resources and oppression and relationships to both legal representation and the ability to communicate, right, one's needs in relationship to the social, in spite of having worked in those domains for decades as a representational worker, and then more recently within the last perhaps 2 or 3 decades as well, actually never mind that, because as early as the early 80s I was in addition to working as an artist concerned with issues of marginalization and oppression and inabilities to require resources for individuals who have historically, right, and in terms of prejudices and constructs of positionalities within our culture, been excluded and denied access to all of these things. In addition to representing those things as an artist, as early as the 1980s, I've also been involved in social programs that attempt to challenge, right, the distribution of resources within our communities and within our social political organizations. So I was going to say that I was more active in those domains within the last 20 or 30 years, but in fact, that's not exactly true either. I have basically, my entire adult, life worked in these areas. And the blanket descriptor, and I'm not good at giving, these words, these blanket descriptors, like, but the blanket descriptor is, social services. But social services is already such a problematic, construct, because generally it articulates, aspects and striations of the social function that marginalizing, creates, to begin with, and maybe we'll get there. If I look at certain terms, in the major turn that I want to make in this discourse from Lizzo to the contemporary language poet Charles Bernstein and his use of language in a piece called Disraphism. And what I want to attempt to argue is lies within that word, which is the misrecognition of dysgraphia as dysgraphism with the missing G, just like the I is missing here, and why in this narrative that I'm constructing of the theatricalization of Lizzo's, censorship. Now, whether that censorship is entirely ironic or right, performatively theatrical, or whether someone really was concerned with the use of this word spaz. That's one of those points of ambiguity that it is probably difficult to determine precisely and even define, but we can certainly discuss the theater of censorship that surrounds the use of this word spaz and its and its reference to or its feigned reference to this particular positionality of disability. So the whole discourse, has to do with, marginalization, positionalities, who can speak, censorship, issues of the use and deployment of language, and what is allowed and what is acceptable, and then this other term that I want to introduce because there's so much irony going on. Let me read this passage, quickly before I enter that. But as for girls, Lizzo originally sings "Hold My Bag." Okay, so already, right, like we're confronted with all these words, that and even the word bag, if you catch the reference, you might not want to utter it. But hold my bag, and then this word, and then hold my bag. Do you see this? And then this word, shit, that doesn't particularly bother me to say, and I'm a spaz. So the shit, and then the bag, and then the other bag, and then this word that is placed here between the bag and the hold my bag, didn't receive the censorship, but the spaz did, and that's of course what we find to be humorous, and then in the presentation that this is actually kind of an interesting presentation of this entire, what I'm calling theatricalization of the discourse. The power of groupthink has evidently, convinced Lizzo to change a lyric from her latest song, Girls, after she was shamed for using the word spaz in one of the verses. As one person wrote, hey, Lizzo, my disability, cerebral palsy, is literally classified as spastic, and I don't even know how to pronounce this, I'm sorry, diplegia, where spasticity refers to unending, painful tightness in my legs. Your new song makes me pretty angry and sad. Spaz doesn't mean freaked out or crazy, it's an ableist slur. Well, if it is an ableist slur, which I'm not entirely, convinced of, but it certainly also does mean, freaked out or crazy. So, so the intention here, one imagines, at least in part, ironic, and ironic, not just in the way that irony has been reduced, in its contemporary use and significance, but in the way that it was originally, right, used in ancient Greek theater as Eirôn, spelled with an E-I-R-O-N, who becomes in Aristophanes and other Greek comedies, the sort of marginalized or less than authoritative, right, or the figure whose social positionality, right, is significantly lower than that of the Alazόν, the braggart, and the braggart, the empowered figure, the sort of Donald Trump, if you take him that way, that basically a complete fool, but whose position, right, authorizes a certain kind of authority, and that authority, is an authority of discourse, but also, an authority of rights and of the ability to perform in the world, without censure. So Lizzo here, is taking on the role of the Eirôn, and I like the comments that she makes in that regard. It's been brought to my attention that there is a harmful word in my new song, Girls. Let me make one thing clear. I never want to promote derogatory language. As a fat black woman in America, I've had many hurtful words used against me, so I understand the power words can have, whether intentionally or in my case, unintentionally. I'm proud to say there's a new version of Girls with a lyric change. This is the result of me listening and taking action. As an influential artist, I'm dedicated to being part of the change I've been waiting to see in the world. And then the signature, and of course, the irony that I'm referring to is if you actually go, to if you actually go to the lyrics themselves, well, almost all of the words are offensive, right? And of course, the offensiveness of those words, ironically relates back to an industry and genre in which misogyny is largely accepted, as are all of these kind of problematic, stereotypes and constructs of, both images of African American manhood and African American womanhood, right? So this word, that we referenced before begins, and then these exclamations of and then the hold my bag, which is also if not a derogatory word, a derogatory referent, and then this word, do you see this shit, hold me back, and then okay, there's the offensive word spaz, now is removed, and then it goes on. And there's some interesting. Oh, I highlighted the Lorena Bobbitt, because I thought that reference was interesting. I'll read this stanza. Let me take these earrings off and hit the boozy ratchet with my friends. Whoa, whoa, oh, whoop and ho. I'ma go Lorena Bobbitt on him, so he never fuck again. Oh no, oh, now you can't fuck again, bro. So this is of course a reference to this famous when was that? Was that sometime in the 90s? Let's look it up. A woman who had been experiencing abuse in her marital relationship, and that abuse, included her husband raping her, I believe repeatedly, and so while he was sleeping, she took a scissors and she cut off his penis. And then what's interesting is this incident made the national headlines, and she stood trial for this, and defended the action with these allegations that he had raped her, and but what clearly was uncomfortable for a lot of the American public, and and the notoriety through which this gained national attention was the castration, not the rape. And so it was an interesting moment in which the patriarchal, in Jung, the unconscious is supposed to belong to the feminine, but but it does so through patriarchy, one could say. But it was so interesting that it was like this unconscious terror or whatever it might be involving castration that promoted the interest and attention to this, and the violence of the rape that in many ways is always already inscribed within patriarchy, sort of dropped out of the concern. Now let me see if I can. I'll open a new window. And see when this was. Okay, so I had said I think I had said early 90s. This was actually late 80s, June 18th, 1989. Oh, I said national attention. International press coverage, right? Because of the horrors of castration, right? And the damage that does to patriarchy, right? In Lacanian terms, like the phallic signifier, is destroyed, right? And we have at least two, members of the Supreme Court that if both of them aren't, actual rapists, they're certainly sexual assailants, and the Supreme Court, represents, right, the law of the phallus, and now, the law of the phallus is doing its work, right? It's taking away women's rights to control their body, but men still have the right to not only perform all these acts of violence upon women, but they can do so in the name of the law of the phallus and become Supreme Court justices. And it's fascinating that so many women are victims of sexual assault and violence, and never receive proper health care, proper medical attention, proper support, vindication, legal vindication, and now can't, right? Legally can't, but you snip away at that penis, boy, and then you get dang, you're gonna get a lot of attention there. So international press coverage. Oh wait, there we go. Okay, so they were married in 1989. So I was right. It was the early 90s. So the incident itself occurred in 1993, and this date refers to the date of their marriage. I don't know why you would even include that, really, but I mean, I guess as a matter of I don't know, to establish, maybe perhaps to establish, how long the abuse had been, going on. But so 1993, when Lorena cut off John's penis, and with a knife. Oh, I said scissors, and it was actually a knife. So my bad. So it was a knife. I don't know why I had remembered scissors. It's just, depending on what kind of scissors that you have, or it might be difficult to cut off a penis, with the scissors. I'm not sure. I've never, attempted to perform that act, so I don't know how difficult or how easy, it might be with. And if you were going to use the scissors, you'd want to use a good pair of, sturdy scissors. Like I have a pair of. You wouldn't want to use one of those kinds of scissors that we used to get in grade school with the rounded ends, so that you wouldn't hurt yourself, and you could cut, pieces of paper with that for art projects. But sometimes, it was difficult. And those were never very sharp. And but I have one that comes with my knife set, and you can trim lettuce or various other kinds of vegetables, and in some instances it's easier than a knife, in some instances it's more difficult with the knife. And another thing that could be used, but that wasn't, clearly wasn't used, was I have some tools that are good for cutting metal. Metal shears and different kinds of tools that those actually seem more useful, for this task than either a knife or an ordinary, scissors, might be. But in any case, it was a knife, and then the penis was subsequently surgically reattached. A few years later, and I can't recall the name of the band, but I think it was a few years later, but around the same time, maybe it was immediately within that time. But there was a song, that became popular called "Detachable Penis," and it was, the singer, the speaker, the first, person subject of this song, if I recall correctly, was male, and it wasn't a violent or graphic representation in this sense of the detachable penis, but it was the penis was detachable in a convenient kind of way. One could leave it at home and go about one's business if one didn't want it along, and but I imagine that it was in some ways, if not consciously, unconsciously, a response to this incident, right? Lorena claimed that her husband had raped and abused her for years, but of course that wasn't what gained attention. John was charged with rape later that year, but was acquitted and went on to star in several pornographic films. Now, that's difficult for me to understand. John was charged with rape later that year, but was acquitted and went on to star in several pornographic films with, presumably, his new reattached penis involved in the making of those films. So I don't understand that at all. Like how both of these things are possible, for him to be acquitted and then become a porn star. I don't understand at all. I maybe the hero of the indomitable phallus. I don't know. The next year, Lorena was acquitted of assault. No, so how is it possible that? Okay, by reason of insanity, because it would. Oh, I see. So that's how it's possible, because you would have to be insane, right, to cut off the phallus. They divorced in 1995. Yeah, presumably it took that long to get the divorce, because I don't imagine that. I mean, in some ways, like this seems like almost like an ironic, theatricalization itself. Bizarre. Let's go back to Lizzo. Okay, so already, in the form, and structure and materiality, right, of girls, before the ironic, controversy here, Lizzo had used a sample of the 1986 Beastie Boys single "Girls" from the trio's debut, Licensed to Ill. And then, the writer here says, had those offended by spaz been more familiar with the song's origins, which, of course they probably were, they'd probably be, which they probably were, more outraged by the lyrics, ad rock, MCA and Mike D were spitting at a time when misogyny, offensive language, and sexism was, but I think it should be were basically celebrated. Live shows of that era featured women in cages dancing on stage and a giant hydraulic penis. So the giant, hydraulic penis, and the reference to Lorena Bobbitt, clearly comes back to this, right? And I guess if we're going to snip the giant hydraulic penis, one would need a very large knife, or as I suggested, a very large pair of shears, to do so, and it's interesting that so much of this discourse depends upon, when we say that, so much of this discourse depends upon the word spaz and its relationship to this condition, spastic diplegia. Now I'm gonna type that in before we move on to Charles Bernstein. Let's see what I get. I'm gonna type in. So here, this is the first thing that comes up. The origin of the word spaz is a shortened verb of spastic. Spastic refers to an alteration in muscle tone affected by the medical condition spasticity. But it seems to me that spastic doesn't necessarily refer to that. Well, we have, spastic colon, spastic diplegia, spastic hemiplegia. Let's see what the etymology of the word spastic actually is. Sudden violent muscular contraction, from Old French spasm, spasmos, a spasm, convulsion, wincing, violent music. Now, so orgasmos is the etymological origin for the word orgasm, and it includes this word organ, right? And so let's look up the word spasm, spasmos. Sudden violent muscular contraction. I don't think this is the best etymology. Let me see if I can find another one. Here we go. So it can refer, to a medical condition involving involuntary contractions of a muscle. But it seems that in fact, that it derives originally, etymologically, right, as spasm and convulsion, to a number of different activities of convulsion based on this word, to draw out or pull out, and has these associations: sudden and temporary burst of energy, right, activity or emotion, which are referenced in this line. Spaz doesn't mean freaked out or crazy, where it clearly actually does. So when this discourse became theatricalized, I found it amusing in terms of the irony involved in all of it, and the irony as Eirôn in all of it. So this let's now turn to a different example of a deployment of language and a kind of ableism and a kind of uncensored, right, reference to a medical condition. Now, I'm going to argue eventually that dysraphism, as presented in Charles Bernstein's poem of that title, is really a decoy. And I've presented work before, earlier. I presented other work that in which Bernstein and I've suggested that it's difficult to decide whether he's demonstrating examples of parapraxia and referring to them as dyspraxia, and doing so ironically as a kind of performance, or whether he's actually what would you say, parapraxic, And I've pointed to the difference between the definitions of parataxis and parapraxis and dyspraxia and dysgraphia in what seemed to be his dogberryistic performances of himself in certain contexts, which is in keeping with a lot of the poetic and performative strategies that Bernstein is that works with. And so I'm going to argue that there are two things going on here that are masked and hidden. There's an invisible G, so that it refers to dysgraphia, and then there's a parapraxis in which dysgraphia is referred to as dysgraphism. And if one doesn't take it that way, then one takes it as, takes it at its word, takes the word at its word as representing dysraphism. And dysraphism, of course, is a spinal condition that I believe develops in utero, in which the spine is separated or curved or broken and exposed. Let's go ahead and look up that word. Before we proceed any further, I think we can leave Lizzo behind at this point. And again, what I'm trying to do is give you a better view of Lizzo here. What I'm trying to do is discuss in some ways how Lizzo's theatricalization of the deployment of these kinds of offensive language is very different from the privilege that Bernstein assumes in being able to take these conditions and transform them into poetics. And viewers of my work will understand my interest and concern, based on a number of different incidents and my own positionality as someone who is dysgraphic and whose work does engage, right, what it means as for an individual to exist within social conditions in which so much of the way that one is evaluated by standard testing and by other apparatuses, right, that sort one into different social categories, is determined by one's ability to perform certain for what some individuals are simple tasks, and for some of us are extraordinarily difficult tasks. All right, so what I want to do now is enter this term, spinal dysraphism. Now, in this case, I don't believe that dysraphism has an etymological origin that would relate to anything other than this condition, right? In other words, there are no uses, idiomatic uses, of dysraphism in the English language. There are no uses of this word which do not relate to spinal dysraphism, but perhaps I'm wrong. Can't find anything there. A lot of words like defective, incomplete. Some of these etymological sites don't really provide the best information. Well, I don't, at least, I'm not aware of any other uses of this word dysraphism or dysraphism in the English language that like spaz, has meanings that relate to a spasm of emotional interest, or a spasm of involuntary contraction, as metaphor. I don't know any uses of that, but Bernstein's own comment on the use of the word, and of course he doesn't confront the missing G and the parapraxis that I'm contending exists, but perhaps hints at it, right? So I'll read this and I'll move around as a kind of perhaps displacement. And this is a quotation of what Bernstein says about this poem, or perhaps it's a volume, in which there's a title piece. Let me finish up by answering that question together with your next one about the usness I write about in Content's Dream. Veil is my most visually oriented work. The visual emblem is produced by several layers of overtyping. So that much, but not all, of the freely composed writing is obliterated. One model I had was Morris Lewis's veil paintings, where successive stains of colors occlude the inner layers, though at the edges the brightness of the suppressed underlayers of color shines through ecstatically. The sense of stain, as in soiling, and its associated sadness is crucial, but also, as in biochemistry, the stain allowing you to identify otherwise invisible substances. So I'm using, okay, so I'm pausing here, but I want to, I'll focus on this idea of invisible substances as perhaps, metaphor of what remains unspoken in this discourse. All right, and hinting at, something that stains or occupies this position of invisibility within dysgraphia or dysgraphia. In this sense, my poetry is an acoustic staining. That's why I'm inclined to dwell on in forms of damage. Okay, so, and then these terms, right? If they aren't, perhaps familiar, point to positionalities that may or may not experience penalization, asylumization, right? Separation, prohibition, exclusion, and who often don't have, because of their not belonging to the domain of the phallus, the privilege of incurring damages, right? And just like Lorena Bobbitt, although she was acquitted of the charges because of an insanity, wasn't able, right, to receive legal justice for the damages that were made against her over a long period of time from what was it 1989 to 1993, right? So that's a period of 4 years of rape and assault and physical violence and presumably verbal violence as well, that that certainly she wouldn't have received national attention for making claims against her assailant based on that long history. But that one moment, I don't know how long it took her to saw through the penis, but presumably it happened very quickly, because presumably at some point, what was his name? John Babbitt would have awoken and protested, right, the removal of his penis. It not being a detachable penis, at that time, and wasn't detachable for very long. Presumably they sewed it back on very quickly, and then presumably when he became a porn star in 1995 or whenever that was, it was no longer detachable or dislocated, though it may have still experienced some degree of maladjustment and may have appeared damaged. I don't know. I don't have access to that imagery, and in fact, don't much care to. But go on. This is not an aesthetic theory so much as an experiential dynamic. I don't really see that, but well, we'll talk about that perhaps later. Call it the everyday, that we have our misalignments more in common than our adjustment to the socially correct norms. Normalcy is the enemy of poetry, my poetry, our poetry, whatever that means. And it's so interesting because, it was, David Anton that refused to sign my letter of recommendation and asked me to sign his letter back, his name, his signature backwards on it, which presumably was a response to my dysgraphia, and a totally, completely traumatizing incident. Maybe not as traumatizing as having your penis cut off, but in some way my penis was already cut off, right? Because being dysgraphic is not possessing the significatory or signaturatory phallus, right? The handwriting as phallic belonging to the culture. So perhaps the writing it backwards was intended as identification of some such failure. Seeing the failure of handwriting as a kind of lack of phallic potency. But in any case, it was Bernstein who, when I called SUNY Buffalo and asked, why I hadn't been admitted to the poetry program, said in a very strange way, didn't exactly explain why, but said that it wasn't my letters of recommendation, which is weird, like instead of saying why I wasn't admitted, saying, well, it wasn't your letters of recommendation, which were very good. And of course, Bernstein was David's friend, and so presumably, was aware of what was going on with the weird, backwards signature event. So the socially correct norms and the, I don't know, like the playing out of this this bad faith, right? Involving this, request to write backwards as a dysgraphic, involved in the sort of like torturous humor of the reference to not being normal. It doesn't seem to me like it's the same kind of theater that we're talking about with it's more like this would be like the John Bobbitt theater, right? I don't know what it would be, honestly, but some kind of weird theater of cruelty in which normalcy clearly is the operative of the symbolic order, right? And anyway, going back to the text, normalcy of poetry, my poetry, our poetry, in quotation marks, our, I don't know how the quotation marks really function there, but when today's New York Times runs a piece on out of sync kids and how we can help them fit in, it's interesting. I'm not sure that, Bernstein ever really helped out of sync kids fit in, whatever that might be, but maybe he did a lot of work, as I did, many decades of work in social services that I'm simply not aware of. I see my poetics and their debt to Hawthorne, Thoreau, and Emerson spelled out in reverse. Well, that really interests me. This spelled out in reverse, because that's precisely my event, right? And it's hard not to take it personally, because it is, what I was asked to spell out, David Anton's name in reverse, right? Because he couldn't be bothered to sign, my letter of recommendation, or refuse to, or even just refuse to do it and come out in an honest and straightforward way and say, no, I don't want to write you a letter of recommendation. But why the perverse theater of cruelty, right? We've all known, then there's a quote, we've all known children like this. Jane Brody begins, they stand too close or they touch us in annoying ways. They laugh too loud, or at the wrong times they make stupid or embarrassing remarks. They mistake friendly actions. I don't know if, Bernstein and David considered, signing David Anton's name backwards friendly rather than hostile. Like, was that friendly? That was like fun. I don't know. It's like if you give someone a pencil who can't write with a pencil and tell them that their life depends on writing something, that's not friendly or fun. It's hostile. And then, there are, of course, consequences, right, to not doing it correctly. Like there are consequences, like to not being able to take the GRE, or to complete, to fill in the little bubbles in the SAT, right? No one, back when I was doing this stuff, no one offered you accommodations, right, of any kind. There were no accommodations made, and there still really aren't. Like you go to any court in the United States, and if you have to fill out paperwork and you say, please, I need some help with this because I have this disability, then they say, fill out this form and then put it over here, and then we'll get back to you. And then you have to say, well, I just told you that I can't fill out those forms. And then if you become a little bit angry about that, then the guards arrive with their little guns and stuff, and they escort you to jail. So this is the way stuff really works. And those aren't friendly actions, okay? Being arrested because you can't fill out the proper paperwork is not friendly, right? Like getting excluded from a graduate program because you have dysgraphia is not friendly. They move too slowly or too fast for everyone else. Their facial expressions don't jive with what they or others are saying, or their experience is seriously out of step with current fashions. Wow, so that's awful, being out of step with current fashions. while I both identify and try to attend to such differences, peculiarities, and idiosyncrasies of perception. That seems ironic to me. The article predictably prescribes the psychological orthodontics of correction and behavioral modification to obliterate the disease, which is given the highfalutin name of dysthymia, flawed signal reception, a suitable companion discipline to my own preoccupation, dysgraphism. Well, okay, so here again is the missing G. How is dysthymia, right, flawed signal reception, in any way related to dysgraphism, right? How is it related to this spinal curve or spinal gap? It's not. I mean, dysthymia only makes sense in relationship to dysgraphia rather than dysgraphism. So, in what way does this make any sense whatsoever unless you presuppose the missing G in this text, right? The veil acknowledges the stigma that is our common ground, our point of adjacency with one another, our usness. Here, veil or vial is related to a short book of my own poems called Stigma, based on the title of one of Irving Goffman. I mean, do we really want to get into Irving Goffman? I mean, this Irving Goffman in his text on asylums, if you were really interested in it, Eirôn reads the whole thing, or at least reads the whole, first chapter, or I believe he does. So you can, look that up in terms of Eirón's, various readings, and what that's about. But it's profoundly about exclusion and the right to work and perform within communities. In the Alazorszán story, a lot of this isn't relevant. That we can't communicate as if we had no veils or bodies or histories separating us, that whatever communication we can manage must be in terms of our opacities and particularities, our resistances and impermeabilities, call it our mutual translucency to each other, our language is our veil. So, all of this is really interesting to me in terms of like what it says on the surface, and then this history, that it fails to record, that speaks, with such volume and vitriol and actual consequence, exactly the opposite of this claim, right? Of this openness to what exists beyond or at the margins of this idea of normalcy, and I suppose that's part of what I find extraordinarily offensive about this, and going back though to have a representation of this piece. Say it were something else, right? Say say that say that this were a different positionality, perhaps one, closer to, Charles's heart. Say that say that this word dysraphism was Jew, right? And that a language poet, wrote procedurally an organization of words based on the word Jew, who would not be offended? Who would not find it offensive, right? In the same way that my experience working in social services with individuals who have diagnoses of extreme mental illness, it's still completely socially acceptable to say all kinds of things about individuals diagnosed with, what we refer to in our culture now as mental illness. And all of these words, right, and deployments of madness, and who gets to write a book called Madness, never having, done the work, but entered into the discourse completely blind and unconscious and ignorant of the way that differences in neuropsychology are socially constructed, right, can promote like offenses, right, and not even be aware of the offensiveness of the use. Whereas, like, if this term were something else, as I suggested, the offense would be so completely obvious. Another example of this was the work that I did on Roosevelt Island, where the old mental institution, the Octagon Tower, was transformed in the late 90s and in the early 2000s into a luxury apartment building and sold as resort living. And I have, in various moments discussed the way that could happen because of the way that we marginalize certain types of positionalities and accept them within these domains. It's acceptable violence of language, of social articulation, right? And how is it that making this asylum a luxury apartment is not offensive? Now, anyone that I asked this question to, I mean, there are very few individuals. If I said, should we make Auschwitz, the remains of Auschwitz, into a luxury apartment building, would not find that offensive, right? So how is it that we continue to not be offended, right, by the Octagon Tower on Roosevelt Island? How is it? And how is it that the game of writing a signature backwards is acceptable? within a discourse, that presumes to offer itself as promoting the marginal. And if you read it, right, you find a lot, more is going on here. And then another thing that I really found interesting was the way that language is used in describing, Bernstein's use of this figure. Bernstein makes clear that he is using a medical term, so he acknowledges, that there isn't any other idiomatic function, in the English language for this term, to describe a method of constructing poems. Raf means seam, as in Rafi. Bernstein writes in a note to the poem, for me, and then the misspelling, dysraphism or dysraphism is misseeming a prosaic device. Perloff remarks in The Dance of the Intellect, and what's missing in this? Studies in the poetry of the Pound tradition, that dysraphism or dysraphism playfully exploits, just the language playfully exploits such rhetorical figures as pun, anaphora, epiphora, metathesis, epigram, anagram, and neologism to create a seamless web of reconstituted words, and that sensitivity to etymologies and latent meanings, presumably such as dysgraphia, right? So acknowledging the latent meanings and at the same time designating them with words like sensitivity and playful exploitation. Is reflected in the poem itself, which is an elaborate, again, dysfunctional fusion of embryonic parts. All of these utterances made without any concern, right, for the violence of language or the positioning of marginalized, medicalized performative acts of language, right? A disturbance of stress, bitch, la 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 la, and rhythm of speech in the interest of a new kind of urban rhapsody. The sound of dysraphism almost achieves the status of a rhapsody or a song, while in it Bernstein achieves, it's good that he can achieve, unlike, the individuals that were institutionalized, moments of brilliant poetic speech. For example, blinded by avenue and filled with adjacency demonstrates exactly how this seeming that Bernstein proposes would work. And I won't go on. But the point is that it seems to me that this is not the kind of ironic theatricalization that Lizzo is performing that I was so amused by, because it challenges the violence that we accept in the society, the patriarchal language, the language of misogyny, and it does so by playfully and performatively, right, employing an instance of what could only be taken as offensive from a very narrow, right, point of intersection and interpretation. And this, it seems to me, is an elaborate, dysfunctional mask of a performance of intellectual verbal violence. And as such, like, cries for a kind of interrogation, and cries out, right, for an interrogation of the function of the latent meanings that are here, hinted at but not spoken, and what they mean in this larger context, in which acts of exclusion are made by, poets and professors who work within these institutions of privilege, and were, fortunate enough to be granted access to these institutions of privilege, and use those privileged positions to exploit, precisely what it is that, so many of us, have been denied, because we remained, outside. Like, trying to get at this idea, why does Bernstein, get to be the one who makes money from my disability when I can't? And does so at the expense of excluding me. and becomes the hero in doing so. And to me, that's utterly outrageous. But that's the institution. To me, that's what Ivy League means. It's precisely the privilege, right, of being able to use, the work of a Van Gogh, who never received, any reward for the paintings that he did in his lifetime, or being able to make, whatever one's career, off of translating Artaud, who died in an asylum and institutionalized, right? It's exactly the same thing. And this is what translation means, to our most esteemed poets. And this is what the dance of the intellect means to our most esteemed critics. And this is what the playful exploits of rhetorical figures means, to our happy poets. And so again, this is the voice crying in the wilderness. Like, how is it different to make the Octagon Tower into a luxury and apartment building than it's any different? Then how is that different from turning Auschwitz into a luxury hotel? And I'll end with that. And I know, of course, that this entire talk is wasted, but it needs to be said. And because there's a lot of violence in that kind of urban rhapsody. And whether you see it or not, Now a window at least has been granted upon it.